I'm Linda Nack, and I'm a docent at the Camron-Stanford House in Oakland, California. And the house was built in 1875, 1876 by Samuel Merritt. He did not plan to live here, he planned to sell it, which he did. It's on the shores of what became Lake Merritt. Lake Merritt was originally a tidal slough, and a tidal slough is water by the tides from the ocean come up the estuary, which you can hardly see in Oakland anymore, and the salt water at high tide would come up and meet water from creeks that were coming down from the hills, from the Oakland hills. And during rainy season and high tide, you'd have the water looking like it looks today. But during the drought part of the year and at low tide, you had a lot of mud flats. This is also an American flyway for birds traveling from Canada to Mexico. This was a perfect place for them to stop and nest, and then go on, either going north or south on their flyway travels. There were Native Americans in the area that lived all around because the tidal slough attracted antelope, bears came down from the hill. All kinds of wildlife was here. There were hunters and so forth. So the slough in 1869 was dammed up. It was the idea of Samuel Merritt to dam the slough and create a lake. The lake was not officially called Lake Merritt, it was called Merritt's Lake. It had been Laguna Peralta because Merritt had bought his 25 acres for the Merritt tract that the Camron-Stanford House stands on now. He had bought it from the Peraltas. Luis Peralta was a soldier for the Spanish crown, and in 1780 he had accompanied the missionaries up the coast of California to the San Francisco mission and to protect them as they were building the missions. He had over 20 years of service, and because of his good service, the Peraltas were given by the Spanish crown 40 to 45,000 acres of land from the bay to the hills and from part of San Leandro all the way to part of El Cerrito. Now, when Luis Peralta, later on in life, he had 9 children, and later on in life he deeded his property to his 4 sons and divided up. Each son got 10 to 15,000 acres. Daughters didn't get anything. They didn't get any inheritance. So one son lived on the east side of what is now Lake Merritt, and one lived on the west side. And this, by common usage, it was originally Laguna Peralta, but because Merritt gave $12,000 of his own money to the city of Oakland to build a weir, which is a name for a wooden dam, and Merritt had the idea of damming the lake, people started calling it Merritt's Lake instead of Laguna Peralta. As a matter of fact, when this was the first waterfowl protected area in the United States. There was there were no national parks or other waters that we know of that are protected today. They weren't written in until later. In 1869, Samuel Merritt was angry because he had a window in his house, which is like 2 blocks from here in the Merritt tract, had a window shot out by a hunter, and he got so mad that he went to his friend who was a legislator with the California legislature and proposed that they write legislation to protect this as a wildfowl protected area. So once that happened, then hunters could not come anymore and hunt in this area. So the waterfowl was protected. One of the hunters also shot one of Merritt's neighbor's cows and killed it. So that was the end of hunting in this area. And it actually says in the legislation, if you read the 1869, 1870 legislation, it says that this is protected, and they name it as Peralta Laguna or Merritt's Lake. So it was just by common usage. It never was officially given the title of Lake Merritt. So as people came in because of the gold rush, and squatters came in, everybody called it Lake Merritt. This is Dr. Merritt's neighborhood. This is a map that we made up of what the area looked like in around 1875. Here is the tract, the 23 to 25 acre piece of land that Samuel Merritt bought from the Peraltas. And this blue dot is the Camron-Stanford House, so you can get an idea of where it is. And actually, this is a photo of the Camron-Stanford House when the Camrons first moved in. And we've got this gigantic eucalyptus tree over here, which you may have seen earlier. It was a skinny little tree when this house was built. So they're in front of the house with their children. In this tract, Samuel Merritt put up some speculation houses, including this one, which he sold to the Camrons. He also put up, I think, one or two other spec houses. The rest were sold as pieces of land to individual people. And it was all beautiful, big. Here are photos of the houses that were on this tract. And you have some very famous names. You have James Folger, who lived right over here, the yellow dot. And there's James Folger's beautiful home. He learned the craft of making coffee from August Schilling, who was the spice owner, if you recognize that name. His house was down the street at the end of the track, right on the lake. And Folger learned Schilling was both spices and coffee early on, and then Folger went off on his own and, of course, started a whole big coffee industry. Now, across the lake, this is not in the Merritt tract, but across the lake, the blue dot is where Anthony Chabot lived. And you probably recognize that name from the Science Center. He had a beautiful house. So the Merritt tract was just filled with beautiful homes. And right here, this was never built up. What ended up being built right here, next to the Camron-Stanford House, was the pumping station in 1909. Oakland got the idea to protect itself from fires like the fires that had raged after the earthquake in 1906 in San Francisco. So they put in a pumping station. And then this was Edson Adams. Adams Point is now where Fairyland is, but Edson Adams had a big mansion there, which around 1890 he built an 18-hole golf course prior to it becoming the Fairyland that we know today. This is a photo from the 1920s of Oakland. We don't know the exact date of it, but we know it's the 1920s because we can see streetcars and little tiny cars on the street there. This is the Camron-Stanford House, and you can see when you look at this whole panorama of Oakland how many Victorian houses there were. Of course, by the 1920s, because of the earthquake in 1906 in San Francisco, people just flocked to Oakland. As a matter of fact, there were only, when the numbers were taken in 1850, there were only 70 people living in Oakland. And by 1860, there were 10,000 people living in Oakland. And by 1900, there were 75,000 people living in Oakland. But by 1910, there were 150,000 people living in Oakland. So people came over and bought up Victorian houses and tore them down so that they could build 2- 3-story apartment buildings. You can see apartment buildings in the vista, but nothing taller than about 3 floors. And they built duplexes, and they just tore the Victorian houses down. Between 1905 '07 and the 1920s, so many houses, hundreds and hundreds of Victorian houses were torn down. We are now in the formal parlor where children were not usually allowed. Adults would meet in here. And this is a fireplace from another home in Oakland that was donated back to us because this painting is of Josiah Stanford, who was the third occupant of this house, second owner. And Josiah Stanford, this is on permanent loan to us from Stanford University. He was a brother of Leland, and he lived in the house the longest of any resident. He lived in this house for 21 years, and he actually took this entire wall out because he was a man of modernity, and he made one big room out of this and the family parlor, and he also put in a first furnace in 1881, so he didn't need these two fireplaces. There's a fireplace here and a fireplace on the other wall. When the house was restored, they had the architectural plans for the house, and they decided to put the wall back in just like the original house when it was built in 1875. This is a photo of Josiah Stanford Jr., who was raised in this house. He was an avid bicycle rider, and bicycles were very popular in the Victorian period, and he belonged to the Oakland Bicycle Club, and here he is with his penny farthing bike, which had the big wheel and then the little wheel. We are now in the family parlor where children were allowed. We've got some children's Victorian chairs so that you can see that children were invited in this room. This room was originally with this fireplace, but this is also a donated fireplace when this wall was rebuilt after the house was restored, after the Oakland Museum left. On the mantle, we have some Egyptian things that David Hughes bought for his wife Matilda for her birthday and sent them back to Europe for her while he was in the Middle East. And this mirror is a Gump mirror, and they realized that when they took it down and they saw the Gump name on the back of it. Here we have all artwork that from the Hughes family. This was on when David Hughes married Matilda Gray. They went on their honeymoon grand tour of Europe for over 2 years, and during that time they traveled quite a bit in Italy and went to artist studios. And that is David Hughes, a bust of David Hughes that was made in Italy. That is a bust of Franklina Gray that was made also in Italy of alabaster. Up there is a painting that was done in Italy of Franklina and a painting of her mother Matilda. This is a painting of Franklina that was done in New York when she was a baby, because she lived in New York until she was 19. She and her mother came out here to do business with David Hughes because Franklina's father had died, and Matilda came to settle up his affairs with David Hughes. They fell in love and they eventually got married. So this room is a mixture of furniture that has been donated back to the house, because of the fact that this was the Oakland Museum for 57 years. All of the carpeting in the house that is here, people say, well, was there really wall-to-wall carpeting in Victorian times? And there was, if you were wealthy enough to have it, because it helped to insulate. The houses were not well insulated. It helped to keep it warm. This is when they restored the house, because the Oakland Museum had ripped out all the carpeting. They had to order this narrow loom carpeting from England, so it was very expensive. When the Oakland Museum left here in 1967-68, and then the group that got together to create a historic house museum of the Camron-Stanford House, they had to order all this, and they spent almost $1 million restoring the house, with woodworking being done, plumbing, electric, glass work being done, metal work being done, and things like carpeting being restored. On the ceiling, we have a fixture. Originally, all of the lighting in the house was lit by gas, and there were all gas lamps in the house. And the rosettes were all taken out by the Oakland Museum, but the function of a rosette in Victorian times, it was not just beautiful, but it was functional in that the gas that came out of the fixture would rise to the ceiling, and it was dirty. So it would make smudges on the ceiling. So this way they could camouflage it by having a darker color rosette as opposed to the lighter color ceiling. And they'd only have to clean it a few times a year instead of every week. This room, when the house was built and the Camrons moved in, was originally a billiard room. But when they rented the house to David Hughes, when David and Matilda came back from their grand tour of Europe, they had bought art all over Italy, France, other countries, but primarily Italy. And particularly in Italy, they bought all student work, where students were learning art by copying old masters. So none of the old masters that you see in here, like there's a Vermeer copy over there, there are other famous painters that worked in the 16th and 17th century that in the 1800s the students of art were copying. David bought all copies. That was a very Victorian thing to do. And this room became the art gallery for David Hughes and his family, and including a beautiful chess checkerboard that was made in Cannes, France, and statuary that was done in Italy. And also in this room that probably wasn't in this room when David Hughes lived here as the art gallery are two Steerhorn chairs that David Hughes was a big lover of the Wild West, and he collected Steerhorn chairs, and they were out in the hallway because the family would have a lot of social gatherings with like 50, 100 people, and they would entertain in that hallway, the entranceway to the house. And the Steerhorn chairs, there were probably 30 or 40 of them. Now we just have the one man Steerhorn chair and one lady Steerhorn chair. This fixture is the only fixture in the house. When the Oakland Museum came and they took all the lighting fixtures down, they stored them, and every single light fixture was pilfered over the 57 years that the Oakland Museum was in this house. But one arm of this fixture was left, and this is King Neptune. The Victorians loved mythology, they loved Egyptology. So King Neptune, we had a metal worker come in and redesign a fixture using the one arm and making 3 of the King Neptune. We are now in the Oakland Museum room, which gives you an idea a little bit of what the Camron-Stanford House looked like when it was the Oakland Museum. Charles Wilcombe, who had come over from the De Young Museum in San Francisco, became the first director of the Oakland Museum, and he brought with him his collection of early American or Native American art, like weavings and basketry and pottery. And we are going to be returning some of these things. They still belong to the Oakland Museum. So some of them are already on display. Part of his collection is on display currently at the Oakland Museum. But we've had some of these things since the 1970s. This is a 1910 picture of the Camron-Stanford House, and here are what some of those upstairs rooms look like. These are the bedrooms where we now have lawyers' offices that help finance the house. But here are the main rooms, like the family parlor or the formal parlor, which became one big room when Stanford lived here. And the Oakland Museum put these encasements on the walls. All of these encasements, when the Oakland Museum left, had to be ripped out. You can see other things from the collection that were shown in the Oakland Museum and how they looked on the walls, how the Oakland Museum was set up for people who came to visit. And here is the colonial fireplace, because it was Charles Wilcombe's idea when they added on this room to give credence to early American history. So when this was the Oakland Museum, starting in 1910, this was the colonial room. And so they had the old colonial fireplace, and we have some photos on the wall over here of a docent taking a group of children in 1927 on a tour in the colonial room to see how they actually cooked in the colonial fireplace. So David Hughes took Franklina Gray and her mother, Matilda, when he married Matilda, on a grand tour honeymoon. They actually left Oakland in 1875 by horse and carriage, went across, met the train, went by train all the way to New York. Not to New York City, they went to Saratoga, because that was, since Franklina and Matilda were originally from New York, they knew Saratoga Springs was beautiful, and that's where she and David got married. When they went on the grand tour, it was Matilda and David, Franklina, and the Aunt Rose, and two in help traveled with them. They got to Saratoga, Matilda and David got married, then they went to New York City, got on a boat, went over to Liverpool, and then started on their route, which you can see with the red line. They circled around because they went down to the Middle East, but Matilda didn't feel well. She was not feeling well. So they came back. She and Franklina and Aunt Rose came back. David Hughes went down again and did more extensive traveling in Egypt and in Jerusalem, Damascus, Beirut, and then up to Constantinople. So they really spent the majority, Matilda and Franklina and Rose spent the majority of their time in Italy and parts of France. And then you can see some of the other stops. They went to Vienna, they were in Brussels, they were in Belgium, they visited lace factories. Franklina wrote to William Bartlett, who was her fiance here in Oakland, and wrote almost every day a letter, which we received all those letters from the family. The letters have been transcribed along with a lot of research into a book that we're publishing, and it will be published very shortly, both in hardcover and softcover.